Sandra Bullock stood at the reception of the dazzling La Majestic, her hoodie and cap a quiet rebellion against its gilded excess. Heather, the receptionist, sized her up with a sneer, her voice dripping with contempt as she all but spat that this wasn't her place. But what crashed through next, when Keanu Reeves entered the scene, would flip the room upside down and unravel a twist so wild it'd leave everyone gasping. Before we rip into this jaw-dropping night, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from. If you're hooked on stories that hit hard, smash subscribe. Tomorrow, we've got another mind-blower for you. Sandra Bullock stood at the reception desk of the La Majestic, her gray hoodie soaked from the relentless New York rain, her baseball cap pulled low over her face. She wasn't here to play celebrity. She was exhausted, bone-tired after a day that had chewed her up and spat her out. All she wanted was a room, a bed, a damn moment to breathe. But the second she stepped up to the counter, Heather, the receptionist with a golden name tag and a stare that could curdle milk, decided Sandra didn't belong. Heather's eyes, cold as twin blades, sliced through the plain fabric of Sandra's hoodie, cutting straight to judgment. No hesitation, no questions, just pure, unfiltered disdain. "Good evening," Heather said, her voice so stiff it might as well have been starched. "How can I assist you?" The words sounded polite, but the way her lips twisted made it clear. She wasn't asking to help. She was asking what the hell someone like Sandra, dressed like a nobody, was doing in her pristine kingdom of crystal chandeliers and overpriced discretion. Sandra didn't flinch. She'd seen this look before, too many times, in too many places. "I have a reservation," she said, keeping her tone steady, firm. "Under Sandra Annette." Heather didn't budge, didn't even glance at the computer. Instead, she tilted her head, just enough to let her superiority hang in the air like a bad smell. "Sandra Annette," she repeated, dragging the name out like it was some kind of joke. "I don't think we have anything under that." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but they didn't move. She wasn't checking. She didn't want to check. To her, Sandra was a glitch in the system, a sweaty, hoodie-wearing intruder who dared to sully the La Majestic's polished marble floors. Sandra exhaled slowly, digging into her pocket for her phone. "I've got the confirmation right here," she said, pulling up the email and sliding the screen across the counter. Proof. Hard evidence. But Heather barely flicked her eyes at it. She let out a sigh, long, exaggerated, the kind you'd give a kid who keeps screwing up. "Oh, I'm sure you do," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm so thick it could choke you. "But this is La Majestic. We cater to exclusive clientele. Maybe there's been a mix-up. Maybe you booked somewhere. More your speed." The jab landed like a punch, and for a split second, Sandra's calm flickered. More her speed. She'd been in this game long enough to know what that meant. Heather didn't see a person. She saw a thrift store outfit and decided that was the whole story. Sandra could have pulled off the cap, let her face do the talking. Hell, she could have made Heather choke on her own smugness. But she didn't. Not yet. "No mix-up," she said, her voice harder now, steel creeping in. "Check again." Heather smirked, a little twitch of her lips that screamed she'd already won. "I'll check," she said, finally tapping the keys, but it was bullshit. Sandra could tell from the way her fingers moved. Slow, lazy, like she was humoring a lost cause. The silence stretched, heavy and sharp, and a few heads in the lobby turned. A couple by the bar paused their drinks. A guy in a suit near the elevator glanced over, curious. Heather didn't notice. Or maybe she did, and she loved it. the power trip, the chance to flex her tiny throne. "Nothing's coming up," Heather said at last, leaning back with a fake pout. "Sandra Annette, right?" "Nope. No VIPs, no nothing. Are you sure you didn't mean the motel down the street?" Her tone was poison, dripping with the kind of glee you get from kicking someone when they're down. She crossed her arms, daring Sandra to push back. And Sandra wanted to. God, she wanted to. But she'd learned a long time ago that losing your cool only feeds the vultures. So she locked eyes with Heather, letting the silence do the work, letting the woman stew in her own petty victory. "I'm sure," Sandra said, slow and deliberate. "Try again, properly this time." Heather's smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat, but she doubled down. "Look, ma'am," she said, the ma'am sharp enough to cut glass. "Our system's crystal clear. If it's not here, it's not here. I can't magic a room out of thin air for you." She leaned forward, lowering her voice like she was doing Sandra a favor. "There's a budget place a few blocks over. You'd fit right in." The room shifted. The guy by the elevator pulled out his phone, subtle but not subtle enough. The couple at the bar whispered. Sandra felt the heat rising in her chest, but she kept it locked down. Heather thought she had the upper hand, thought she could shove Sandra out the door and call it a night. She had no idea who she was screwing with. Not yet. But the clock was ticking, and the next move wasn't hers to make. Sandra Bullock stood like a statue at the Majestic's reception desk, her phone shoved forward with the reservation email screaming the truth Heather refused to see. She'd laid it bare, proof in black and white, but Heather didn't give a damn. The receptionist crossed her arms, her smirk a jagged slash across her face, and let out a scoff that could peel paint. "Yeah, I see your little email," she said, her voice a venomous hiss, barely glancing at the screen before flicking it away like it was garbage. "But here's the thing. Systems crash, emails lie. I'm not seeing squat under Sandra Annette." Her fingers grazed the keyboard, a mocking tap-tap, then stopped dead. She wasn't checking. She was taunting. Sandra's blood simmered, but she clamped it down hard. She'd faced mobs of flashing cameras, directors tearing her apart. But this was a knife twisting in her gut. Heather wasn't just stalling. She was reveling in it, her eyes glinting with the thrill of crushing someone she'd already written off. "It's there," Sandra said, her voice a low growl, sharp enough to slice through the receptionist's swagger. "Look again." She shoved the phone closer, her stare boring into Heather's skull, a silent command. "Try me." Heather snatched the phone, her nails clicking like claws, and gave it a half-second squint before slamming it back down. "Sandra Annette," she sneered, stretching the name into a punchline. "Nada. Zilch. You sure you didn't book some dump instead?" She leaned in, her breath hot with spite. "There's a Fleabag joint down the street, cheap, grimy, perfect for you." The words were a Molotov cocktail, and Heather lit the fuse, grinning as she watched for the explosion. The lobby's glitz, marble floors, jazz humming, couldn't mask the rot in Heather's soul. It was a brutal contrast. The place oozed class. But this gatekeeper was a snarling beast, high on her petty throne. Sandra's chest burned with the injustice. She could end this circus, yank off the cap, let her fame slap Heather senseless. But that'd mean torching the one thing she'd been clinging to: anonymity. She was a heartbeat away from snapping, her mind a battlefield. Stay low or swing back and damn the fallout. "You're not even looking," Sandra said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, every syllable a loaded gun. "Check it. Now." Heather flinched. Just a flicker, but her smirk roared back, nastier than ever. "I'm doing my damn job," she spat, the damn a jagged edge. "Keeping this hotel elite, not digging through garbage for some nobody's reservation." She tossed her hair, a queen dismissing a beggar, and Sandra's restraint cracked like thin ice. Her fists balled under the counter, nails biting into her palms. She'd scratched her way up from dirt, bled for every win, and this smug little dictator thought she could erase her with a sneer. "It's not garbage," Sandra shot back, her words a whip crack. "It's mine. Do it." Heather rolled her eyes so hard it echoed, then started typing. Slow, deliberate, a middle finger in every click. "Fine," she muttered, venom dripping. "But don't cry when it's not here. This place isn't for scrubs." That did it. The word, scrubs, hit Sandra like a brick to the face, ignition to a fuse she'd been strangling all night. She could taste the fight rising, the urge to slam Heather's nose into that keyboard and watch her choke on her own bile. But she'd learned the hard way. Rage feeds the wolves. So she locked it down, her stare a laser carving through Heather's bravado, waiting for the bitch to trip over her own trap. The lobby stirred, predators smelling blood. A slick-suited guy at the bar froze mid-sip, his eyes darting like a hawk. A woman by the fireplace hissed something to her husband, who craned his neck, hungry for the kill. And the creep by the elevator. He had his phone out, lens aimed like a sniper, snapping Sandra's profile. She clocked him, her gut twisting as the spotlight she'd dodged all day crept closer. Shit. One viral pic, and this nightmare would explode. Heather caught the shift, and it juiced her up. She raised her voice, a stage performer now. "Listen, Miss Annette," she drawled, the name a taunt. "I've checked. Twice. Nothing. Maybe you got conned. Those sketchy sites'll do that." She flashed a grin, all fangs. "I'd hate to see you stuck here, though. That dive I mentioned, it's got your name all over it." She was practically dancing on Sandra's grave, oblivious to the storm brewing. Sandra's thread snapped. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice a blade slashing through the noise. "You're wrong. Fix it." Heather's grin stuttered, her mask slipping, but she lunged back. "I'm not wrong," she snarled, all pretense gone. "You're the one who's lost. Dress like you belong, and maybe I'd care." The air turned electric. The phone guy's thumb twitched, poised to record. The couple gaped, jaws slack. Sandra felt the heat, the stares, the gall, the sheer audacity of this woman who thought she could bury her alive. She could end it now, blow it all wide open. But inside, the war raged. Hide or fight. Heather leaned closer, oblivious, her arrogance a balloon stretched to burst. "Walk away," she hissed, "or rot here. Your funeral." Sandra didn't budge. Her eyes were fire, and Heather was about to burn. The air in the Majestic lobby was a live wire, crackling with the venom Heather had spewed, and the fire Sandra barely held back. Heather leaned over the counter, her smirk a jagged blade, her words still ringing, "Walk away, or rot here," like she'd already won. Sandra's eyes burned, her fists clenched so tight her knuckles whitened, every muscle coiled to strike. The creep with the phone hovered, ready to immortalize her breaking point. The couple by the fireplace stared, jaws unhinged. The guy at the bar licked his lips, smelling blood. And then the doors burst open. A gust of cold, wet wind ripped through the lobby, dragging raindrops across the marble like shrapnel. Heads snapped toward the entrance. The security guard jolted upright, his hand twitching toward his radio. And there he was, Keanu Reeves, stepping in from the storm, his black suit sharp as a razor, his white shirt crisp despite the damp clinging to his shoes. He didn't rush, didn't falter, just moved with a calm that sucked the oxygen out of the room. His presence was a sledgehammer, quiet but crushing, and every eye locked on him like he'd flipped a switch. Sandra saw him first, her breath caught, a flicker of relief cutting through the rage. Keanu's gaze swept the scene, Heather's sneer, the phone guy's sneaky lens, the gawkers, and landed on her. The cap still shadowed her face, but it didn't matter. He knew her in a heartbeat. His steps didn't waver, deliberate and unyielding, closing the gap between the door and the desk in seconds. Heather didn't clock him yet, too busy basking in her cheap victory. But the lobby did. The creep's phone dipped. The couple gasped. The bar guy choked on his drink. Keanu stopped beside Sandra, close enough that she felt the heat off him, a silent shield against the storm she'd been weathering alone. He didn't look at Heather. Not yet. His eyes stayed on Sandra, soft but piercing, like he could see the war she'd been fighting inside. "Hey," he said, his voice low, steady, cutting through the chaos like a lifeline. "You good? What's going on?" Simple words, but they landed like thunder, shaking the ground under Heather's feet. Sandra exhaled, a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Not exactly," she said, her tone dry, nodding toward Heather. "She's refusing my reservation, says I don't belong." Keanu's head tilted, just a fraction, and then he turned, slowly, deliberately. His eyes locked on Heather, and the shift was instant, like the air itself tightened around her throat. Heather froze mid-smirk, her bravado crumbling as she registered who was staring her down. Her mouth opened, then shut, a fish gasping on dry land. "You're refusing her reservation?" Keanu repeated, his voice still calm, but now it carried a weight that pinned Heather to the spot. She blinked, rapid fire, her hands fumbling to the keyboard like she could undo the last 10 minutes. I didn't," she stammered, her voice a high-pitched squeak, all that venom evaporating under his gaze. Keanu didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, arms loose at his sides, his silence louder than any accusation she could have dodged. It was a paradox. His stillness screamed, shredding her flimsy shield of arrogance. Heather's fingers scrambled over the keys, a frantic tap dance, but her eyes kept darting to Keanu, then Sandra, then back. Sweat beaded on her forehead. "I checked," she blurted, desperation clawing through her lie. "It's not in the system. Must be a glitch." Keanu stepped closer, just one step, and the lobby held its breath. He leaned on the counter, casual but commanding, his shadow swallowing her space. "A glitch," he said, flat, letting the word hang like a guillotine. "So you told her to leave, told her she doesn't belong." Heather's face drained white, her lips trembling. "I didn't mean... She didn't look..." She cut herself off, realizing every word was a shovel digging her deeper. Keanu's eyes narrowed, not angry, not yet, just sharp, dissecting her. "She didn't look what?" he pressed, his voice a blade now, slicing through her excuses. Heather shrank, her shoulders hunching, but she couldn't answer, couldn't say it. The truth was a neon sign flashing over her head. She didn't look rich, didn't look important. Sandra crossed her arms, watching Heather squirm. She could have jumped in, could have twisted the knife, but she didn't. Keanu had this, and she trusted him to gut the moment clean. He straightened, his height looming, and dropped the bomb. "Let me ask you something," he said, his tone so even it was terrifying. If she wasn't someone special, if I hadn't walked in, would you have changed your tune? The question was a grenade, pin pulled, rolling across the counter. Heather's eyes widened, her breath hitching. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The lobby went dead silent, every ear straining, every eye pinned on her. She couldn't lie, not with him staring through her soul. I would have, she started, then choked, her voice collapsing under the weight of her own bullshit. Keanu didn't move, didn't blink, just let her dangle there, exposed. The guy with the phone was filming now, not even hiding it. The couple clutched each other, whispering, "Is that him?" The bar guy's glass hit the counter with a clink. Heather's world was imploding, and she knew it. She'd misjudged, misfired, and now the power she'd wielded like a club was dust in her hands. Keanu turned to Sandra, a flicker of a smile tugging at his lips. "You got that confirmation handy?" he asked, casual, like they were grabbing coffee, not standing in the wreckage of Heather's ego. Sandra nodded, sliding the phone toward him. He picked it up, glanced at it, then set it down right in front of Heather. "There it is," he said, tapping the screen. "Sandra Annette, reserved weeks ago. Funny how it's right there when you actually look." Heather's hands shook as she grabbed the phone, her eyes darting over the email like it was a death sentence. I'll fix it," she mumbled, her voice barely audible, her fingers flying over the keys for real this time. Keanu watched, arms crossed now, his calm a storm cloud ready to break. "Good," he said, simple, final. "Because she's staying, and you're done playing gatekeeper." The manager burst from a side door, pale and sweating, his tie askew. "Mr. Reeves! Miss Bullock!" he yelped, rushing over, hands wringing. "I'm so sorry. This is unacceptable." Keanu held up a hand, stopping him cold. "It's handled," he said, his voice a quiet command. "But we're not done here." He glanced at Sandra, then back at Heather, who looked like she'd been hit by a truck. The power had flipped. Heather's throne was ash, and Keanu stood tall, the hero no one saw coming. The Majestic lobby was a graveyard of silence, the air thick with the wreckage of Heather's collapse. Keanu Reeves stood like a sentinel beside Sandra Bullock, his arms crossed, his calm a steel wall that kept the chaos at bay. Heather was a mess, sweat streaking her perfect makeup, hands trembling as she fumbled with the keyboard, her once sharp tongue reduced to stammers. The manager, Mr. Williams, hovered nearby, his face a mask of panic, wringing his hands like a kid caught stealing. "Mr. Reeves, Miss Bullock," he sputtered, voice cracking. "I can't apologize enough. This isn't how we operate. Please, let me fix this." Sandra's eyes flicked to Keanu, a silent question passing between them. She could have let it end here. Let Heather crash and burn, let the manager grovel, walk away with her room key and call it a night. But something held her back, a nagging itch she couldn't shake. Keanu nodded, just a tilt of his head, and stepped forward. "Hold off on the apologies," he said, his voice low but firm, cutting through Williams' babble like a knife. "We're not done talking to her." He jerked his chin at Heather, who flinched like she'd been slapped. Williams blinked, confused. "Her? But sir, I assure you, we'll handle—" Keanu raised a hand, shutting him down. "Not yet. Step back." The manager hesitated, then obeyed, retreating a few feet, his eyes darting between the trio like he was watching a bomb tick. Heather looked up, her gaze wild, trapped. "What? What do you want?" she rasped, her voice a brittle thread. She braced herself, expecting the axe, firing, humiliation, maybe a lawsuit. But Keanu didn't swing. He just leaned on the counter, closer now, his eyes locking hers in a grip she couldn't escape. "Why'd you do it?" he asked, simple, direct, but loaded with a weight that made her shrink. "Why'd you treat her like that?" Heather's mouth opened, then shut, her breath hitching. She glanced at Sandra, then away, her hands balling into fists. I didn't know who she was," she muttered, barely audible, a lame excuse that crumbled as it left her lips. Sandra stepped up beside Keanu, her cap still low, her voice steady but edged. "That's not an answer. You didn't even try. You judged me before I opened my mouth. Why?" The lobby watched, breathless. The creep with the phone had lowered it, caught off guard. The couple by the fireplace leaned in, ears straining, Heather's face twisted, a storm of panic and defiance, but under it, something cracked. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes dropping to the counter. "Because I hate people like you," she whispered, so quiet it was almost lost, but it hit like a gunshot. Sandra blinked. Keanu didn't move, just waited, letting the confession bleed out. Heather's hands shook as she gripped the edge of the desk, her voice rising, raw and jagged. "You waltz in here, or anywhere, and get everything handed to you. Fame, money, respect, She stopped, swallowing hard, her eyes glistening. I tried so damn hard. Acting classes, auditions, years of rejection. Hollywood chewed me up, spit me out, told me I wasn't good enough, and now I'm stuck here, kissing ass for people who got what I couldn't." Her words spilled fast, a dam bursting, her bitterness a flood no one saw coming. Sandra's breath caught, Keanu's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Heather wasn't just the bitchy gatekeeper anymore. She was a mirror, reflecting a pain Sandra knew too well. La Majestic wasn't just a hotel. It was a twisted lens, magnifying Heather's shattered dreams, every guest a reminder of what she'd lost. "So you took it out on me," Sandra said, not accusing, just stating it, her voice softer now, probing. Heather's head snapped up, her eyes wet but defiant. "Yeah, I did. You didn't look the part, hoodie, no flash. I thought you were nobody. I wanted you to feel what I felt, small, worthless." The admission hung there, raw and ugly, stripping Heather bare. Williams shifted, uncomfortable, clearly itching to intervene, but Keanu shot him a look that pinned him in place. Sandra took off her cap, letting it drop to the counter, her face fully exposed now. Not as a weapon, but a bridge. "I've been there," she said, her tone quiet but piercing. "The grind, the rejection. I got lucky, yeah, but it wasn't handed to me. I fought for it. You think I don't remember what it's like to be invisible?" Heather stared, her defiance flickering, replaced by something fragile. Shock, maybe shame. Keanu leaned in, his voice a steady anchor. "You're not wrong to be pissed," he said, surprising her. "Hollywood's a meat grinder. But you don't get to swing at everyone else because it broke you. She didn't do that to you." He nodded at Sandra, his gaze unwavering. "You made a choice tonight. Own it." Heather's lip trembled, her hands unclenching, falling limp. "I didn't mean, I just—" She stopped, tears spilling now, her armor gone. "I'm stuck. This job, this place, it's all I've got left. I see people like you, and it's like salt in the wound." Her voice cracked, and she wiped her face, smearing mascara. "I screwed up. I know it. But I didn't think—" She trailed off, looking at Sandra, then Keanu, like she was seeing them for the first time. Sandra studied her, the anger in her chest cooling, replaced by something heavier, recognition. Heather wasn't just a villain. She was a casualty, wounded and lashing out. The conflict shifted. No longer a showdown, but a reckoning. "You didn't think," Sandra finished for her, gentle but firm. "But you did it anyway. That's the line you crossed." Keanu straightened, his presence still commanding but softer now. "Question is," he said, "what happens next?" Heather looked up, eyes wide, bracing for the hammer. The lobby held its breath again, the manager pale as a ghost. But the blow didn't come. Not yet. Sandra and Keanu exchanged a glance, a silent pact forming. This wasn't over, but it wasn't going the way anyone expected. The Majestic lobby hung in a fragile hush, Heather's confession still echoing off the marble walls. Her mascara-streaked face was a battlefield, shame warring with defiance, her hands gripping the counter like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Keanu Reeves stood steady, his presence a quiet anchor, while Sandra Bullock watched her, cap off, her gaze softer but unyielding. Mr. Williams, the manager, shuffled forward again, his voice a nervous squeak. "Miss Bullock, Mr. Reeves, please, let me make this right. Free suite, dinner, anything you want. She'll be dealt with, I swear." Sandra's lips pressed into a thin line. She could smell the desperation on him, the kind of groveling that came with a PR nightmare brewing. Keanu shot her a look, sharp, unspoken, and she nodded back. They weren't here for handouts. "Save it," Keanu said, his voice low, cutting Williams off mid-plea. The manager froze, mouth flapping uselessly. "We don't want your comps. We want to talk about her." He nodded at Heather, who flinched like she'd been zapped. Her eyes darting between them, braced for the guillotine. Heather's breath hitched. "What? What do you mean?" She stammered, her voice raw, shredded from crying. She'd spilled her guts, her failed acting dreams, her bitterness, and now she waited for the hammer. Fired, blacklisted, roasted online, she could see it all crashing down. But Sandra stepped closer, her shadow falling over the counter, and what she said next flipped the script. "You're not getting off that easy," she said, firm but steady, no trace of venom. "But you're not done either." Heather blinked, confusion wrinkling her forehead. Keanu picked up the thread, his tone even but laced with purpose. "You messed up tonight, big time, but we're not here to bury you." He paused, letting that sink in, then dropped the bomb. "You keep your job, on one condition." The lobby gasped, literally gasped, the couple by the fireplace clutching each other, the phone guy's jaw dropping. Williams sputtered, "Sir, I don't—" But Keanu's glare shut him up fast. Sandra took over, her voice cutting through the static. "We've got a project, community stuff, something we fund. Acting workshops for kids who can't afford it. Kids like I used to be, like you probably were once." She leaned in, eyes locked on Heather's. "You're gonna help run it. Teach them. Use what you learned, the hard way." Heather's mouth fell open, a choked sound escaping. "Me? Why?" Her brain was short-circuiting, the lifeline too wild to grab. "Because everyone's got a story," Sandra said, her words slow, sinking deep. "Yours doesn't have to define you. You decide what comes next." Heather stared, tears pooling again. But these were different. Shock, not defeat. Keanu crossed his arms, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You've got the chops. Acting, surviving rejection. Put it to work. Make it mean something." He glanced at Sandra, then back. "Or you can stay here, rotting in your own resentment. Your call." The weight of it hit Heather like a freight train. She didn't speak, couldn't, just nodded, her hands shaking as she wiped her face. Williams stepped in, cautious now. If that's what you want, we'll make it happen. His tone said he'd rather fire her, but he wasn't dumb enough to argue. Sandra grabbed her cap, tucking it back on. It's settled then. We're done here. She picked up her bag, Keanu snagging his own, and they turned toward the elevator without another word. Heather watched them go, stunned, silent, her chest heaving. The lobby buzzed, whispers, stares, but she didn't hear it. The fire under her ashes, the one she'd buried under years of anger, flickered awake. Not a blaze to destroy, but a warmth to build something new. She'd been handed a shot, not a punishment, not erasure, but redemption she didn't see coming. Sandra and Keanu stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut, leaving behind a seed of hope she couldn't unsee. As they disappeared, Williams muttered something about protocols, but Heather didn't care. She sank against the counter, her mind racing. Teach kids? Act again? It was insane, terrifying, but it sparked something she hadn't felt in years. The couple by the fireplace whispered, "Did they just save her?" The phone guy pocketed his device, muttering, "That's some next-level shit." The lobby settled, but Heather didn't. She was still standing when her shift ended, staring at the spot where they'd been, a lifeline burning in her hands. Sandra and Keanu were gone, but they'd left more than a room key behind. They'd lit a match under Heather's wreckage, and she'd have to choose whether to let it grow. Heather's story teaches us that judgment can blind us, but redemption can heal. In life, we'll meet people who lash out from their own pain. Don't just strike back. Look deeper. Everyone's fighting a battle you might not see. Sandra and Keanu didn't destroy her. They handed her a chance to rebuild. Apply that. When someone wrongs you, consider their scars before you swing. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's power to break cycles of bitterness. And if you're the one who's fallen, take the lifeline. Your past doesn't own you. Your choices do. Turn ashes into fire.